The age we live in has an important difference from previous times. People want to live life with their whole body. Although the issue of life has always been topical in human history, it has never been as important as it is today. From the very first day of its birth, the human race did not want to live a blind natural life, leaving itself to the flow of nature. Yes, it was connected to nature, but it always wanted to conquer Mother Nature. The source of this desire to win is self-awareness. As he became aware of his difference from other biological species, especially his ability to think and love, he tried to occupy an appropriate position in the world of being. Thus, man began to make history. Religions and philosophical schools form ideals of self-realization, and civilizations become expressions of these ideals. Gradually, human identity began to encompass additional layers determined by geographical and historical circumstances. In addition to being a person, he became the bearer of national, religious, social, cultural, and other identities. Man lost his sense of reality and began to accept as reality the illusions he invented for himself. Nati Kata, like Don Quixote, went to war with windmills. New false identities are like a burden on man's shoulders, diversifying his desires and aspirations, multiplying conflicts and making his life more difficult. Countless religions, philosophical schools, political systems, ideologies, legal theories, moral norms, economic models, historical thoughts, and scientific discoveries have been born out of man's desire to be happy, but instead of quenching his thirst, they have only increased it. But in addition to all this, the cry of the paradise lost within him has never ceased, and this cry has given him the hope of building that paradise with his own hands. A voice calling him to dive into his inner world, urging him to get rid of illusions, to be himself, to live happily in accordance with his true identity. Once lost in the dark and terrifying forest, once reassured that this is how the gods made us, that we will be free after death, that we must be content with this, then one cannot rest. Either it takes a different turn on every road that comes its way, or it takes off, or it commits suicide out of boredom. Humanity is in this situation now. It is already beginning to realize that this jungle into which it has fallen is nothing but an illusion. So how does one get out of this mirage? How can one close one's ears to the myriad voices attacking it from outside? Where to start? To get rid of the chaos in our lives, we first need to calm down. This is not about deep spiritual peace. Let us say to ourselves for a moment, stop. Let's stop. Let's give our eye a chance to worry about ourselves. Neither we nor anyone else will lose from this. Let's calmly ask ourselves this question: where am I and where do I want to go? In order to organize our lives full of chaotic movements and sudden events, we first need to understand where we are and what we want. A simple and effortless start. Only a person who is concerned about his own situation can ask himself this question. I would even say that this question can only arise in human beings. Earlier, we compared life to a forest. All kinds of creatures can feel comfortable in the jungle, except man, who will certainly try to change the situation to ensure his own comfort and safety. He is afraid to go with the flow and fall into an unknown path. He is afraid of mystery and darkness. We are now armed with this simple logic. Where have we fallen and where are we going? We have to ask ourselves. You know that this question can instill fear. We are a strange and contradictory being. We manage to get used to being afraid of the dark. We don't want to leave the comfort zone we have created for ourselves during this period. It is easier to look around and live like others than to change it. So we are prone to conformism as well as the desire to change. We both want to be different and are afraid of being isolated from society. And all of this is natural. By thinking, by asking ourselves a few questions, we will not lose our comfort. On the contrary, we will find solutions to our worries. The human desire for comfort is a very natural, even fundamental desire, and it is impossible to live without this feeling. But like any desire, the desire for comfort to sweeten life becomes the spoils of life when it is misdirected. Sometimes we strive to be different because it is fashionable to be different in society, and we think we are misfits. But if you think about it, it turns out that our efforts to look different are also rooted in conformist tendencies. because we try to be different because of social demand, not intrinsically. Sometimes we manage to live in another world without being any different from others. That's why we should focus on content, not forms. What can comfort us? What kind of life can fulfill us? These are important questions, but unless one is interested in the real state of one's body, thinking about these questions will be fruitless. A happy life program should be based on the humanities. The complexity of the issue lies in this. Human self-awareness remains, as always, a problem for philosophy, science, and religion. According to Max Scheler, man is the only being who does not know himself, and in the 20th century he admitted that he did not know himself. In other words, the claim that human beings know everything, arising from religious or scientific knowledge, has become meaningless since the 20th century. Man realized that the path to self-knowledge is infinite. This raises a perplexing question. If one can never fully understand oneself, is happiness possible? For now, let us not rush to answer this question. If there is a demand within us, there must be a response to that demand. Whether it is a material, intellectual, or spiritual need, it is absolutely necessary to provide for it. If someone who disagrees with reality needs a better life, so be it, life is possible. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a new era in Western philosophy began, called existentialism. Earlier philosophical schools, by placing man in the mold of the soul or the body, in effect presented him with mutually exclusive choices. If the choice is made in favor of spirit, the scientific and technological progress of humanity loses its significance. On the contrary, if the choice was made in favor of matter, the cultural and spiritual characteristics of man were denied. Such a radical approach was almost obsolete by the beginning of the last century and drew a boundary between human existence and its essence. Man came to be understood as a willful and conscious being who chooses not between soul and body, but between different essences according to his nature. He was declared to be a being capable of creating a superior reality by not conforming to the existing reality. Man has discovered the horizons of being, in Nietzsche's words, superhuman. Islam's understanding of human evolution, with the logic of the Quran, breaks the molds imposed on him by the world around him and becomes the perfect human being with his own inner potential. Doubt you, we have guided him, either sin or be ungrateful. In other words, our way of life can and should be better and more enjoyable at any time. But for this to happen, one must be dissatisfied with one's current situation. One of the fundamental factors that distinguishes man from other beings is precisely this. He is the only being who has the power to challenge reality. It is precisely this characteristic of man that is the engine of any evolution. For him, conformity to the status quo is tantamount to stagnation and regression. Do you know how the Prophet Muhammad began his invitation? He went up Mount Safa to deliver his first message to the people and addressed the Meccans. After the crowd gathered around him, he asked, "Would you believe me if I told you that the enemy was preparing to attack you from behind the mountain?" As soon as he said this, the Meccans believed him so much that some of them took up arms. When the people answered in the affirmative, he said, "If you believe me, know that the day of judgment will come." In other words, the Prophet did not start his invitation with any current social issue or religious philosophical debate. He wanted to give the Meccans a mild shock so that they would put aside their worries at home and think about their lives for a moment. If the Prophet had started his speech with a long exhortation and sermon, he would have been no different from a philosopher. At best, he would listen and praise him, and then everyone would go back to their work. That is why it was so important for people to think about the meaning and responsibility of life. New life is so uncomfortable that it has to start with the question, who am I? Probably no one has not heard the word kafir in Islamic terminology. Unfortunately, in most cases, this word is understood at the level of takfirism. Simply put, in pre-Islamic times, the Arabs called anyone who covered something up a kafir. In Islamic terminology, this word has come to mean irreligious, faithless, because a kafir is understood as a person who exaggerates his material needs to cover up his spiritual needs. In fact, a kafir is a person who focuses his mind only on his surroundings and forgets his soul. A person who experiences inner anxiety and is indifferent to this anxiety is a disbeliever and therefore cannot be happy. This is because he is striving for a one-sided development, not a comprehensive one. Therefore, if one wants to know oneself and be happy, one must first of all not settle for the status quo. Who am I and who can I become? This is the only question one can ask oneself. All the revolutions in history, all the great events that have changed the lives of humanity have been based on this question. Could the Arabs have built a great civilization if they had been content with their semi-savage desert life? Would there have been great geographical discoveries, renaissances and bourgeois revolutions if Europe in the Middle Ages had accepted the fact that it was a periphery of civilization and a poor continent? Usually, when one cannot find a place for oneself in the existing reality, one dreams of building a better reality. The dynamics of life depend on this factor. A person must first create the need for progress in order to be able to strive for it later. Otherwise, every progressive idea will remain so. At this stage, it is not necessary for a person to have any idea of what progress will bring him or her. He or she only needs to discover within himself or herself the desire to change the status quo. Just as a person who is not thirsty drinks water to his own detriment, the efforts of a person who is not thirsty to change will seem like a heavy burden. For example, there are traditional societies that do not need a modern state, modern legislation, and a modern economy, but are forced to modernize at the insistence of international institutions and political leaders. Unprepared for change, countries that change rather than develop are left in an even more miserable situation. Just as social change must arise out of social order, human change must arise out of inner needs. According to psychologists, during adolescence, every human being ponders the meaning of life and searches for his or her place in it. This question distinguishes between living and being. Unfortunately, modern culture, or rather the culture injected into the brain under the name of modernity, does not allow people to ask themselves this question. Postmodern views, in particular, explain the person not as a single individual, but as a collection of unrelated characteristics. On the other hand, the cult of consumption instills in people an artificial sense of peace. To be happy, you need to have these things. The person who has the most expensive phone, the most expensive car, the two-story villa seems to have all his problems solved and has started a life of joy. It is argued that a person cannot do more than that, so it is not worth thinking about a better life. This system, which has turned into modern slavery, turns the fulfillment of all human needs into a commercial transaction. Erich Fromm rightly pointed out that even love is subject to the laws of the market economy. We even choose the person we are supposed to love as a kind of commodity on display, whether or not his financial income, physical appearance, social status suits us. When we pass him on the street, do we conform to each other or not? Do others have it or not? Every aspect of life has become similar. Coping with this situation is presented as modernity and development. Although not explicitly stated, in essence, society is being offered to become a herd. After all, everyone in the herd calmly grazes in the blue meadow and doesn't mind being bought and sold in the market or taken to the slaughterhouse. At first, man is content with what he has. He does not want a better life, so his thinking weakens and he gradually loses his humanity. To be such a person is in itself painful, and such a life is hell. To replace inertia with dynamism, we first need to fully understand how painful and harmful inertia is. At the same time, we need to see the possibility of dynamism. After all, if a qualitatively better way of life is impossible, then what can stop a person from predation? Then neither crime, nor injustice, nor cruelty should be condemned. But our nature does not accept predation. Even when we do a bad deed, we are comforted by the fact that it is for the betterment of our livelihood, that it is good and useful. Every phenomenon created by man is justified only by the factor of progress and development. The desire for a better life drives man to build an orderly society, to enforce rules, to create science and art. Our present civilization was built precisely at the expense of preventing stagnation. Oppression, unhappiness, and suffering are the factors that keep man and society from progress. The refuge of those who are content with the life of this world and find comfort in it, and of those who are ignorant of our signs, is the fire because of what they have earned. The person who thinks that life is going on meaninglessly, who is satisfied with what he has achieved and wants nothing more, who closes his eyes and ears to what is going on around him, is actually in pain. He is already in hell. If he does not change his situation, he will take the pain of this world with him into the hereafter. The one who does not want to move forward, to be aware of everything, to give meaning to his life, lives in a deceptive serenity. He is framing himself, drowning out the voice of his heart. After all, if he listens to the cry from within, he will lose the false consolation. It's very difficult to break the conformist mold, because if we follow our hearts, we will face the mystery of the future. It seems that we are constantly faced with two choices: go with the flow of events or go against the flow. We take comfort in the fact that if we drift, we will be like everyone else. We try to convince ourselves that in the worst case, we will end up as bad as everyone else. And when we decide to go against the flow, we panic of loneliness. This is why most people like to go with the flow and listen to other people's opinions. In fact, many outwardly rebellious and publicly defiant young people do this just for the sake of fashion. They too rebel against the conventions of society in order not to fall behind their fellow students, and so they think they are free. But the essence of this dangerous tendency is that the modern value system and the way of life that emerges from it create conditions for these young people to form bubbles in order to tame them in the future. After a while, they will graduate from university, get a job to live on, and have to gain social status. These conditions will trigger it again. Today's young people are not much different from previous generations. A script has already been prepared for his life. If he wants to achieve material prosperity, which is what everyone wants, he will have to take into account the rules that have been instilled in him. If not, let him drown his sorrows in alcohol, just like in Hollywood movies. Isn't this the romance of nonconformity? So going against the flow does not automatically mean rebellion against the conventions of society. The rebellion must start against oneself. Man's rebellion against society arises from the ego. A serious problem arises when the ego and instinctual demands are not met by society, as Freud says. In the first case, one submits to the dominant culture and suffers from unfulfilled dreams. That is, one lives in constant stress, sacrificing one's own desires to the opinions of others. In the second case, he must join the struggle and submit to the dictates of his ego and instincts. As a result, the burden of many revolutions and social reforms falls on the shoulders of the most selfish, stubborn people, ready to fight for their instincts to the last drop of their blood. Wherever you go, you are confronted with a frightening and disturbing picture. It is either to submit to the ego of others or to subordinate others to one's own ego. To break this circle of irrationality, we need to get to know ourselves. Try to find answers to questions that don't make us feel comfortable, and think of alternative choices.